Hey, I have to add one thing. I have to add one thing. If you read the Hayes Post today, you may know that this is not just Patty Nicholas, but this is the award-winning Patty Nicholas, who was just, now I'm going to embarrass you, but very deservedly given an award of distinction from the Smoky Hill Trail Association. She's been involved in helping preserve the archives and knowledge about the trail, which was really important back in the 1800s for the gold rushers and then for the military as well. So,
Well,
it's a really pretty award, by the way. Get her to show it to you.
and welcome to this week's edition. This is one of Halloween, and this is a fitting subject for Halloween. The Blue Light Lady. Those of you who have lived in this area for a while have probably heard the stories of Elizabeth Hawley. The late Robert Maxwell, a retired professor of English, who was a great storyteller. He did a lot of research into Elizabeth Hawley, and he was probably the most responsible for keeping the legend of Elizabeth alive. The two articles here among several articles that Mr. Maxwell wrote regarding his research, and that's where I got a lot of the information from this presentation came from these two articles. Other research material came from Rodney Staub, who wrote a pretty lengthy newspaper article for the Hayes Daily News in 1984. And Rodney he graduated with a master's degree here from Fort Hayes. And then Father Blaine Berkey, who is another local historian, he wrote an article that was in At Home in Ellis County, Kansas. Some of you may have seen it. It's that 2-volume blue book that talks about the history of Ellis County. And as is the case with legends, there are some people who say Elizabeth Hawley never existed. Father Blaine Berkey argues that since Ephraim Hawley never had a wife named Elizabeth, we really don't know who was buried in the grave southwest of Hayes. I have talked to other historians who have done research, but they haven't published anything. And one that I talked to the other day said that with all the research he had done, he would say that Elizabeth Hawley did exist. He said there is information out there, we just need to find it. So let's get started with the story, and you can come to your own conclusion about whether Mrs. Hawley did exist or not, and if there is a ghost roaming the hill southwest of the fort.
I hope so.
The story begins when Elizabeth and Ephraim Hawley arrived at Fort Fletcher on March 28, 1867. Fort Fletcher was located about 5 miles south of present-day Walker. It's about 20 miles from Hayes. And there had been plans to move the fort closer to the railroad, but when Fort Fletcher was flooded later in the spring of 1867, that just moved the plans up, and the fort was moved to its present location in June, and it was renamed Fort Hayes. Ephraim was a hospital steward, and Elizabeth was a nurse. Other stories indicate that Ephraim was a sutler, which was a civilian merchant who dealt with in military provisions along the trail. And according to that story, they arrived at the fort during the cholera epidemic in the summer of 1867. And even though she was untrained, Elizabeth volunteered her services to help with caring for the sick and dying soldiers. The cholera epidemic started in July 1867 with the first recorded death on July 16th. Records show different numbers of soldier deaths. A letter written near Fort Hays on August 20th indicated that 21 men had died and 82 people in all had died. Cemetery records show 23 victims, with 10 of them from the Company F of the Thames Cavalry. There are no records of civilian deaths. During the time that Elizabeth cared for the soldiers, they called her the little angel of mercy. During the evening, Elizabeth and Ephraim would take walks out to Sentinel Hill, which is located southwest of the fort. And she loved the view of the prairie from that spot. Elizabeth eventually became ill from cholera, and on her deathbed she asked to be buried at Sentinel Hill. And when she died, she was dressed in her blue dress and a white bonnet. The soldiers went to bury her at the top of the hill, only to find that it was bedrock. So of course you couldn't really dig very deep for that. So they buried her a little ways away from the hill, and a gravestone marked the site. There was indeed an Ephraim Polly who came to Fort Hays, and he served as a hospital steward or a nurse. He was born February 9, 1842 in Greenville, Ohio, and his family eventually moved to Indiana and then Iowa. He served during the Civil War in Colorado. He married Adeline Decker in Iowa on May 29, 1864, and she divorced him on October 17, 1866. And her marriage license shows her name as Elizabeth Decker. There, Elizabeth was Adeline's middle name. Ephraim served at Fort Hays as a hospital steward or a nurse from March 28, 1867 until April 25, 1873. And one note going back to the divorce, just 4 days after they were divorced, Adeline married John T. Pauley. It is unknown if John and Ephraim were related. And John was also the person who officiated the marriage between Ephraim and Adeline. So that's,
Can't make this stuff up.
that's pretty interesting. Okay. Okay, this is after 1867. Ephraim married Catherine Hammond's wife. She was known as Kate at Fort Hays on August 24, 1868, and became a stepfather to a young boy. Kate and Ephraim had 2 daughters born while they were at Fort Hays, and they lost 2 sons who died very young. Eventually, the couple moved to Canadian Texas, and Kate died there on May 2nd, 1899. And Ephraim remarried. Guess who?
Right.
On April 6th. In 1902. And then Ephraim died 3 years later in 1905. And this is a census record from 1870. It shows Ephraim, but it shows his name is Edward. And then Kate, and then her son Alexander. And Ephraim's initials were E.E. But I'm not sure if it was Ephraim Edward or if it was Edward Ephraim. I haven't really been able to figure that out yet. This is information from the United States Register of Enlistment in the United States Army. And it shows that indeed Ephraim was here. that blue line that I circled, it shows his name and the date of appointment was August 23rd, 1865. Date of enlistment was August 23rd, 1865, and then again 1868, and again in 1871. The company organization was General Service. Remark was that he was discharged from on August 27, 1871, expiration of service at Fort Hays, Kansas. And then he was discharged again in 1873. And I couldn't really read the last part of it, but it had the date 78. So I don't know if it meant 1878, but so this is one way to be sure that he was here at Fort Hays. Here's another register which shows the regiment with the hospital, and the company he was a steward. His address is Fort Hays, and the date of order from his discharge was, and he re-enlisted, and then date of his enlistment into the U.S. service was August 27, 1868. So, okay. Getting a little thirsty here. Okay. Now here's the interesting part. There are no records or documents of Elizabeth Polly and Ephraim Polly's file. Descendants who have stopped by the fort have told employees that the story they heard was that during the time after Elizabeth died, her name was not to be mentioned at all in the family. Nobody was to mention her name whatsoever. And I have been told by one researcher that Kate, Ephraim's second wife, was a mean-spirited woman. So it's possible that she's the one that told everybody that they can't talk about Elizabeth Polly. There were several mentions of her in the newspapers after she died. The first one being about 2.5 years after her death. And that was in the Hays City Sentinel on February 28, 1879. They talked about the lonely grave. We would state that the grave at the top of the mound, flanking Fort Hays on the west, contained all that is mortal of Mrs. Polly, wife of a hospital steward who died during the cholera epidemic of August 1867. General Gibson, who was in command of the post, permitted the burial to be made at the point selected by Mrs. Polly, who had a curious mixture of superstition and fanciful religion in her mental structure. And I have to admit, when I read that for the first time, I thought, that's interesting. The second mention of her comes from an article from the Hays Republican in 1901, written by Agnes Shores. And I won't read the whole thing, but the first part of it goes, on the hill southwest of the old forsaken post is a lonely grave, marked only with a wooden slab telling the date of death 33 years ago, and the name of the woman who lies in the neglected grave. She was the wife of Mr. Polly, the hospital steward at the post in 1867. She nursed many a sick and dying soldier, and at last was overtaken by that dread disease, cholera, and gave up her life. Her last request was, let me be buried on yonder hill where I can overlook and watch the people of the post. The third mention of her is in a July 6, 1901 article from the Hays Republican. and it's written by T.J. Bryant. And he says, I now descended from the hill, and as I did so, I observed a long grave with a plain board at the head and one at the foot. The inscription upon the board at the head of the grave had become illegible and was almost completely effaced by the ruthless hands of time. The name of the woman who was buried on the foot of the hill was Mrs. Pauley, wife of Ephraim Pauley. Her request was that she be buried upon the top of the hill, and the soldiers who were detailed to prepare the grave actually commenced to work on making the grave upon the summit of the hill. But owing to the fact that the soil was so shallow, they soon struck rock, and their work was abandoned, and they made the grave at the foot of the hill where the soil was deep. And you talk about the lone grave, there's a picture of the lone grave. There's a lone grave near town from the 1915 edition of the college yearbook, Reveille. There's also some tales involving some famous figures. 8-year-old Frank Stout was asked to drive a gentleman to Elizabeth Pauley's grave in 1878. The gentleman was Jesse James. And this comes from a book called Historic Haze. It was written by William Alexander Hill in 1938. And there's just speculation that Jesse had even ever been in Haze. But a note about this, another note is that in some of the materials that have been researched, it said that Mr. Pauley was in Liberty, Missouri at one time, and that Elizabeth may have been from there. Clay County, where Liberty is located, is also known as the home of the James brothers. The family farm is located near Kearney, Missouri. And then Clay Allison, Texas cattle rancher and gunfighter, supposedly had a short stay in Hays in 1879. There's a statement from a book about Clay Allison that was written by F. Stanley. And he wrote that Mrs. Pauley was a wife of 11 days when she became one of the first victims of cholera. And then he also went on to say, E.E. Pauley never tired of telling the story of that lone soul on the hill, waiting to see who would be carried off to Boot Hill next. Allison passed the grave many a time and often discussed it with Pauley. Again, there's some people that say that there's no known contemporary account that Clay Allison was ever in Hays. He did visit Dodge City a few times. Okay, now we're going to get on to the story. I don't know if some of you may have heard this story. Those of you who listen to Bob Maxwell, this is the story that he was told. He got to know a man named John Smith, John A. Smith, during the early years of World War II, while they were both working on farms in the area. John told him of his encounter with the lady in the blue gown, sometime in April or May of 1917. The Smith family lived on land that used to be part of the Fort Hays military reservation. John was out early one morning rounding up their cattle when he saw a woman walking across the pasture towards the lone grave at the top of Sentinel Hill. She was wearing a long, dark, old-fashioned gown and a white bonnet. Smith followed after her, but his dog ran home, and his horse fought against him going further towards the figure. He went back home And he told his family to keep an eye on the old shack that the woman had gone into. But later that evening, they reported to him that they did not see anybody enter or leave the shack. He went to the shack and nothing had been disturbed. The second story involved a patrolman. In 1950, he was driving on the bypass around the old fort about 2:30 in the morning. And his car hit a woman head on. And he called headquarters asking for assistance. When the other officer arrived, the first officer told him that the woman had been wearing a long blue dress and a white bonnet. They looked around but found no evidence that she had even been there. The patrolman kept insisting that the woman was there. I know she was there. The third story that I've heard is from a custom harvest crew member from Texas. He was cutting wheat during the summer of 1977, just southwest of the fort. His name is Mark Gilbert, and Mark said he saw a woman wearing a blue dress drifting in his headlight. When he later finished and headed to town, he remembered the keys were left in the combine, so he went to get them. As he got into the cab, he felt someone watching him. He turned and looked down and saw a whitish blue glow with the figure of the same woman he had seen drifting in his headlight. There have been other stories about a sighting of a woman wearing a blue dress walking in the vicinity of the fort. And the thing that makes it interesting is that the people who are telling these stories are not people from this area. They have no idea about Elizabeth Polly. They never heard the story. They don't know that she was dressed in a blue dress and a white bonnet. So that makes it pretty interesting. There are two memorials for Elizabeth. Both of them were constructed by Pete Felton. The marker near Sentinel Hill was constructed in the early 1960s for the Saturday Afternoon Club, the Fort Hays Nurses Club, and District 13 of the Kansas State Nurses Association. They were the ones that asked to have this marker put up. And then at the corner of 26th and Indian Trail in Hays, there's a park called Elizabeth Polly Park. And Pete Felton was asked to make a sculpture for the park. And that park was dedicated in May of 1982. So the special collection, the University Archives, has many more stories within its walls. From the history of the university to the history of Kansas and the American West, the special collection has several unique collections. If you would like to, we're going to have a little tour afterward. But thank you for taking time out on your Friday afternoon to come hear about our local ghost.
Thank you, Patty.
You're welcome.
And next Friday, we'll have a presentation from Mason Phoenix, Open Education Librarian, and he will talk on copyright. Can you or can you not use this in your classroom? Probably not. Anyway. No, that just. So if you want to stay, and Patty and I will take you into the special collections area if you have the time, and some more chocolate if you need it.
If you have any questions about the Blue Light Lady or anything, I don't know if I'll be able to answer them, but.
Thanks, Patty.
Is there
Blue Light
any
thing?
is there any particular phase of the moon? Is it always really the dark of night or full moon, or is there any correlation with any of that?
I don't, as far as I know, there isn't any correlation with that.
So the people that find ghosts and phenomena did say they found activity out there,
Mm-hmm.
Oh, the ghost hunters?
whatever they are.
Paranormal.
Those people.
Does anybody have a ghost detector on your phone? There
We
is
have
one.
that app.
Jen has it. We need to go.
Well, let's take Janet and go.
And don't trespass. No, I'm joking.
Is that marker on university land or is it private land?
The marker's on private land. Yeah. But I think you can see it from the road.
How
Is it
far can you
illegal
go?
to go there?
Pardon?
Is it illegal to go on your land?
Is it illegal? Yeah, but like I said, you can see it from the road. So,
Wear a blue dress and a white bonnet.
Well, when you go, I want to go with you.
Want to see it.
Bob Wilhelm,
breaking the law.
who worked at the fort, he told me some other stories too, including the one about the officers' quarters, one of the houses. It was in town. They had moved it to town. And there are stories that when it was in town, there were college students living in it, and they would hear footsteps going up the stairs or a door slamming. And there was a story of one young man who was sitting in the room studying, and he heard something, and he saw a dent being made in his bed, like somebody was sitting down in it. So it's I'm sure that Mr. Wilhelm has a lot of other different stories like that too, but that's one of the ones that he told me. Well, thank you for
The only
coming.
way to kind of sweep the grass.